It's another really stark picture we've been given today of what's happening with our climate here in the UK, a picture of rising temperatures, rising sea levels and increased rainfall. I'm standing by the banks of the Severn Estuary where they're upgrading a 17-kilometre stretch of flood defences because with more frequent extreme weather events there's more need for protection from them. And speaking of extreme weather events, it just so happens that the Met Office is now warning that southern parts of the UK are about to experience another storm. It's called Storm Evert. The Floods Minister for England surveys yet more newly enhanced flood defences. This project in South Gloucestershire is part of an £80 million scheme designed to protect 2,500 properties. And, said the Minister, launching England's new flood and coastal erosion investment plan, more is on the way.
Today we are announcing our £860 million first tranche of our huge commitment to spending £5.2 billion on flood defences and flood protection to better protect 330,000 properties to make people feel safer, homes and businesses for the future.
You don't have to look far for more graphic reminders of the devastation flooding can cause. This was in Western Germany, where earlier this month more than 160 people were killed. Intense storms hit parts of Belgium too, where the latest provisional death toll stands at 38. The catastrophes from extreme weather once again dominating headlines. Today's announcement on flood schemes in England coincides with yet another report setting out just how much our climate here in the UK is changing. And this time it comes from the UK's leading meteorologists, who've mapped our climate for the year 2020, noting it was the third warmest, the fifth wettest and the eighth sunniest year on record.
Climate change is not just something that is going to happen in the future. We are already seeing that in our observations. It is something that is happening now.
Obviously it's come up to the 6 foot on the wall.
The rainfall which swept in with storms Kira and Dennis form part of the UK's wettest February since records began in 1862 and at the tail end of the fifth warmest winter on record.
We only need to go back 5 years to December 2015. That was the wettest December on record. In 2012 we had the wettest April and the wettest June on record, and in 2009 the wettest November on record. So we've had 5 out of the 12 months of the year have been the wettest on record for the UK in just over the decade, and that's a remarkable statistic.
More sun in the UK too, as well as rain. 2020 had the sunniest spring on record, and more heat. Since 1884, the top 10 warmest years have all occurred since 2002. The most recent decade on average has been half a degree warmer than the previous 30-year average temperature and 1.1 degrees warmer than the 30 years to 1990. Which means, they warn, the likelihood of British summers to come with regular 40-degree summer heat waves and the harms that that can bring.
So we know 800 to 900 people die in the UK per year because of heat-related illnesses.
Dan Mitchell, who studies climate hazards, says cities are particularly vulnerable.
Cities trap heat. It's what we call the urban heat island effect. And that's a problem because you might have a global temperature increase of, say, 1 degree, but that might lead to more increase over land and even more over cities. So often with climate change and in our larger cities, we're talking around 5 degrees extra heat, which is very significant if you think about 5 degrees from the current climate.
But when it comes to adapting to all of this, the UK government's advisors on climate change recently offered a withering assessment. It was a government leading in diagnosis, said the Climate Change Committee, but lagging in action and still blundering into high carbon choices as the need to decarbonise grows ever more critical. This is all about mitigating the impact of climate change, but is your government acting rapidly enough to deal with the root causes of the problems here to decarbonise, to hit those net zero targets, because the Climate Change Committee doesn't think you are.
Yeah, so we're responding to all of those comments made by the Climate Change Committee, and indeed actually a great deal has happened since they published that report, and that potentially might not have been included in the report, but they quite clearly we always listen to what they say. But this government is doing more than almost any other country to commit to this new future that we've got to deal with.
This new future, it is, as today's report from the meteorologists powerfully illustrates, a future we're already living with.
So, more rain and more heat, more extreme weather events in the UK. Well, our weather presenter Liam Dutton is with me. Liam, what did you make of the report?
Well, it's a real eye-opener, Jackie. You know, it's a big report that's come out, a lot of information in there, and it proves, you know, it demonstrates just how much our climate is changing. It's getting hotter, it's getting wetter. And in Andy Davis's report, some staggering figures there. The top 10 warmest years on record have all happened since 2002, 6 of the 10 wettest since 1998. And as the planet continues to warm, extreme weather won't just happen more often, it'll happen more frequently, which will in turn put more pressure on things like infrastructure, you know, biodiversity, people's health and safety. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of investment that needs to be made in order to face up to what lies ahead in the future.
When you look back over last year, which extreme events stood out for you in terms of climate change?
Well, there were two. There was the one at the beginning of the year, which we heard about in Andy Davis's piece, the wettest February on record in the UK, storms Kira and Dennis back to back, a tremendous amount of rain, all that flooding. And as the planet continues to warm, we'll see wetter winters, which will increase the risk of seeing flooding events like that one. And then fast forward to August, we had a heat wave in southern England where 6 consecutive days reached 34 degrees or higher, thought to be responsible for around 2,000 excess deaths. And of course, as temperatures rise globally, heat waves in the UK will become more intense and more prolonged and have greater impacts. There's a lot to get through, a lot to deal with, and hopefully that will be dealt with in COP26 at the end of the year.
Liam, thanks so much for joining us. Well, the Met Office report suggests that the climate here in this part of the world is changing faster than it is elsewhere in the UK. East Anglia and the East Midlands are the two regions which saw average annual temperatures increase by more than 1 degree Celsius over the last 30 years. Well, joining me now is the Conservationist and Wildlife Ambassador at Norfolk Wildlife Trust, Nick Atchison, and environmental economist at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Matthew Agarwala. Thanks both for joining us. Nick Atchison first. You've seen extreme weather events here in the last few years. What do they actually mean, though, on the ground? Why are they important?
It's hard to say at this stage exactly what they mean in terms of our wildlife and the impacts that they will have on our wildlife, because trends tend to take longer to develop. But already we're seeing shifts in the ranges of species. So we're having species colonising the UK, which didn't live here until very recently. So species like little egrets and great egrets are moving here. Now that seems like a good idea, but for every species that colonises from the south, inevitably a species that likes more Arctic conditions is going to wink out somewhere. So we're already beginning to see the colonisation of many species, but also it becomes harder to manage many reserves because the patterns of weather that we're used to are no longer there.
I mean, as a conservationist, this is your life's work, but you know, if you're a family struggling to get by, the environment can often feel very low down as a priority. How do we change that? Why is it important to all of us? What's happening here?
As a species, we have lost sight of our place in the natural world. We are another natural species, one of the many, many millions which inhabit the planet. And yet, through our intellect, we've separated ourselves increasingly from the natural world. But we have to remember that our very existence depends on having fresh water, on having clean air, on having a habitable climate. And in many parts of the world, we're now looking at not having a habitable climate. So over and above our daily lives, there is the very fact that we can't exist without a functional environment.
And Dr. Agarwala, I mean, this report very starkly says today climate change is happening, and it's happening here.
Yeah, and it's absolutely true. We like to think that climate change is something that happens in far-flung parts of the world. But the reality is, our economy, all of it, from the smallest local farm shop to the biggest companies on the planet, the whole thing is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural environment. And so when we think about the family at home trying to figure out how to put bread on the table and how to manage their finances over the next year, one of the things that really does matter to them is, what's their heating bill going to be like? How much is it going to cost them for transportation? Are they going to get a flood? And if so, how are they going to manage that? Right? And all of these things have real economic costs for families.
And we've seen in recent times, both here and in Western Europe, the devastating impact of flooding. We saw 160 people who died in Germany, and the government have planned to spend 5.2 billion, they say, on flood defences. But have we left it too late?
Well, we are where we are now. We have to invest aggressively all across the economy, up and down the country, in every sector. And so some of this is going to be stuff that we do to adapt to climate change that is already in the pipeline. So flood defenses, or retrofitting buildings so that they're better insulated, and so we don't need as many fossil fuels to heat them. But other investments that we're going to need are going to transform the skills of our labor force so that going forward, we have green jobs that put us at the forefront of a global, competitive green economy. If we miss that opportunity, like we did after the last financial crisis, there won't be time to make it up again.
But do you see, this question really to both of you, do you see the political will and the will among the wider society to tackle this now?
The political will is very slow in coming, and there are lots of slogans and big ideas, but translating that into meaningful action has been very, very slow. And we, as Norfolk Wildlife Trust, for 95 years have been protecting what land we can, but against a tremendous amount of opposition. And you use the word aggressively, we now are in a stage of aggressively trying to convince people to take care of soils, to take care of water, to take care of landscape, because it is landscape in which we ourselves belong and exist, and without which we can't survive.
But you're an economist, and you know that this is up against people's needs for houses, for example.
Well, absolutely. So when we're building new houses, we need to make sure that we're not building them in floodplains. We know that's a bad idea. And when we think about the materials out of which we build those homes, we need the innovations in material sciences to come online so that we can build out of materials that store and sequester carbon, rather than out of materials that release carbon in their generation and production.
But I mean, so much is resting, it would seem, politically on COP26. You know, the government are talking about it all the time. What does it need to deliver?
It needs to deliver a tremendous amount, but I feel that we, not just we as Norfolk Wildlife Trust, as the Wildlife Trust movement, but we as society need to move away from a submissive, accepting, I'm not saying become violent, but if we think about the change in the voting rights of women with the suffrage movement, it took a certain amount of standing up and being listened to for societal change to take place, and we really are in a situation. COVID is just a warm-up to what we can look forward to.
But very briefly, one of the big questions, you talk about society standing up and joining this fight, as it were, but it's the cost to the individual. We see a report today suggesting families may have to pay £400 a year more for food and travel if we're going to reach net zero. That's a hard sell, isn't it?
It's a difficult sell, but only because it's communicated through bad economics. And the reality is that the costs that we need to lay out to invest in reducing emissions and in adapting to climate change are many times smaller than the costs that all of us are going to face as individuals and collectively if we ignore our obligations to decarbonize now. If we don't decarbonize, the costs of climate change will dwarf the costs of this pandemic.
Very, very briefly to both of you, are you optimistic?
I feel, as you said, we're in the situation that we're in, and we have to throw everything we have, without fear, at trying to fix it.
Optimistic?
There are tremendous opportunities to create new jobs, enhance productivity. We just need the bold, gutsy leadership to get us there.
Both of you, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you.